Hello again, YouTube. It's Kevin here for Superpower Broadcasting. It's the 9th of April, 2019, and today I'm going to be talking about the electability of Bernie Sanders and the issue of voter rates as it relates to age demographics. So, one of the big talking points that you see right now on the left end of the spectrum as it relates to Sanders is his very high polling and his very high support and energy among young voters, in particular voters under the age of 35. And that's undeniable that that energy exists, that it's disproportionate amongst the younger demographic. What's interesting about this, though, is that when we look at the demographics of voting in general, in terms of age, there are stark differences in terms of the rates at which they actually vote. And so in this video, I'm going to be talking about why that caveat as it relates to Bernie Sanders' popularity is really important and is a really big red flag in terms of looking at his potential electability. So I'm pretty cynical when it comes to looking at a lot of these things. I've been involved and engaged and interested in politics now for basically over 10 years. And what's interesting is that I'm obviously quite young. I'm within that demographic. I'm 25, and so I'm in the perfect demographic of age for somebody that Bernie Sanders would appeal to. And yet, I feel that ultimately me being in this demographic gives you the perspective to be able to kind of break through some of the hype surrounding this, because a lot of people that I know, I mean, of course this is anecdotal information, and I'll have stats later on in the video to reaffirm what I'm going to say here, but there are very engaged, very, very passionate young people that I know that not only show up to each election, but they'll vote in the municipal, they will vote in elections that are some would characterize as inconsequential local level elections, and yet they'll show up and vote or even potentially run for candidacy at the very local level. So they're very engaged in politics, but that's the exception, that's not the rule. A lot of young people that I know, people around my age and whatnot, couldn't care, they really couldn't care less about politics. And that's not some sort of new disillusionment with the whole, Trump and populism and everything. That's a general tendency for a lot of people in general, but particularly young people that don't have much in the way of assets yet, where they feel disconnected, and they feel that it's not worth the energy investing in to researching and caring about the political system, and in some cases, and then there's a rational argument to be made that, well, maybe that is a logical that is a logical sort of predisposition to have, because if you don't have that much invested in the system, then maybe it makes sense to, I don't know, do something else that gives you a greater utility, like, say, for example, play Fortnite, or I don't know, whatever you want to do, basically, outside the sphere of politics. It's interesting, though, because when we look at the engagement of young people in general, as I mentioned, that it's kind of very sort of bifurcated between very, very engaged and passionate young people that I would argue, by and large, disproportionately are more engaged in politics. Like, if you're a young person and you are interested in politics and you are engaged in politics, you are likely more engaged and more involved in politics than a lot of the older demographics. They're, like I mentioned, young people that care about politics generally really care and are really passionate about particular issues and everything. Of course, there are very passionate people in older demographics, but that energy and everything generally tends to be characterized by the younger age bracket. And so where there are engaged and young people, such as who support Bernie Sanders, they're very likely to turn up and vote. If they're already engaged in politics, they're very likely to show up on Bernie's behalf in that sense. And so that's an asset for Bernie Sanders right there, to have engaged young people that do care support him, say, over other candidates such as Joe Biden or Amy Klobuchar, whoever else. Though I would argue to some extent that there is a name recognition factor involved there, but again, it's an undeniable fact that Bernie does have this resonance among percentage of young voters that is a clear asset to have. It's very impressive to that extent. What's interesting though is that there's more apathy in this demographic though. So if you're not interested in politics, or if you're someone on the fence about it, you're much more likely to not vote. You're much more likely to discount the importance of actually showing up on election day and casting your ballot, basically. And so that's obviously an issue, and that more characterizes younger people than, say, retirees. And so it's in that respect, it's a definite hold up in terms of Bernie Sanders' electability. And so that's one of the things I'm going to go into here. So there was polling that was done in the years between 2002 up to the 2016 election that was looking at U.S. presidential voter turnout by age. And what it found was that older voters between the ages of 18 and 29 in the U.S. Tended to vote in presidential elections at an average rate of about 40 to 45%, which is low. It's really low. Of course, the average voter turnout is also low. It's somewhere around 50% or so. Voters over the age of 60, however, vote at a rate greater than 80%, which is impressive. I mean, there are countries out there that pride themselves on having very healthy, filled with vitality, liberal democracies that pride themselves on high voter turnout, where they don't get 80% voter turnout. That 80% is big, and so even if you have a relatively small demographic set, that can still overcome an advantage in other demographics just by having that sheer concentration of political engagement in one group. But as it relates to elections, now an important caveat here is that with some of the young people that don't necessarily vote, there is usually an engagement in politics outside of elections. There might be an apathy towards the election system, but people in that age demographic still might show up to protest and whatnot. They might believe in other ways of going about affecting political change. So it's not to say that just because you don't vote, you don't care about politics, or that you're not engaged politically. But I would argue that, well, if you're not engaged at the ballot box, you are forfeiting your most powerful venue through which to affect change, because protesting and whatnot, that's not the best way to ultimately change the composition of administrations and whatnot. That's a way to maybe get attention and maybe raise awareness for an issue. But if the policy makers that could actually legislate on behalf of resolving whatever issue you perceive, if they're from the other side and they don't see it as an issue, then you can protest anything you want. It's not really going to make a difference. I mean, the two most powerful ways, I would argue the two most powerful ways of affecting political change right now in the Western world, but in particular the United States, are: one, show up to vote and cast your ballot, and two, make as much as reasonable political contribution in terms of financial donation. Especially at the larger level, campaign finance is arguably a better way to affect change than voting. But if you're somebody who doesn't necessarily have that much free capital to donate to a particular political cause or candidate, then the best way that you can affect change is going up and showing up to the polls, because the ballot box, there's no check for, oh, what's your net worth, what's your income, or whatever. Anybody can vote. That's your right as a citizen. So take advantage of that. So ultimately, when it comes to Bernie Sanders, so he has a very strong polling, very strong numbers amongst people under the age of 35. The problem is those stats, the stark ones were 18 to 29 and then over 60. The problem is there are a lot of people over 60 for Bernie. The problem is that a lot of people over 60 vote for Bernie, or that a lot of people that are over 60 that Bernie needs to have high sort of numbers in. The people that actually really vote, they don't necessarily have the same sort of approval for him. And so it's interesting that that percentage, it's so great that ultimately what it means is that, and these are long-term trends. This isn't just something from 2002. We could go back and look at polling from the 80s, the 70s, and so on. Generally speaking, it's a trend that people over 60 vote in high concentrations, people under 35 vote in low concentrations. Even if people under 35 are a greater number, you can still overcome that advantage. And what it means is that the political process, the political composition of administrations, the party that gets elected, the legislation that follows might be one or even two generations behind where the under 35 demographic is politically. So even say, for example, if 100% of people under the age of 35 said that they would vote for Bernie Sanders, you could still have a country where policies such as those that the Republicans are going for would win almost all of the time, because if the older demographic that votes the most and has the most political clout and donates the most and maxes out their individual campaign contributions the most, if they're the ones that are doing that, then it's almost irrelevant to that extent what the people under 35 think about an issue, because the politicians care about their interest group. They care about their keys to power. And what's interesting is that the YouTuber CGP Grey, I believe is his username, he did a video on dictatorships versus democracies and how to hold on to power. And he argued that basically the primary difference in a democracy versus a dictatorship is that in a dictatorship, your keys to power are few in number and will often include regional ministers and generals. But that in a democracy, your keys to power are just larger, but it's ultimately the same game where you have interest groups to represent, get votes. And if you can hold on to them, you stay in power. And if you don't hold on to them, if they go for somebody else, then you ultimately lose power in the next election. Now, democracies are much more peaceful and nonviolent way of going about these political processes, but ultimately it's a very similar game. And so politicians are beholden to their interest groups. And so if you're a politician, are you going to court and spend most of your energy focused on courting a demographic that statistically doesn't vote in very large numbers, and thereby waste all your time and energy in campaigning and going door to door and giving speeches and going on TV and doing interviews and everything else just to lose? Or are you going to pursue the age demographics that tend to vote? And so the concerns, the interests, the ultimate priorities of that demographic, particularly the people over age 60, get disproportionately represented by politicians because they vote disproportionately in high numbers. It's a very logical way of looking at the system. It makes a lot of sense, and I would argue it's actually a fairly fair way of doing it, even though I disagree with most of those old school values that get represented. In a democracy, it's still a fair thing to have. And so a lot of the opinion and attitude and disposition with respect to the political process that we see in people under 35 in particular is that there's this sort of chicken and egg fallacy that goes on, where a lot of young people argue, well, they're not going to vote, or they're not going to care, or they're not going to invest the energy into going in and making a difference because the politicians don't represent them and the political system doesn't care about them. That's the argument. And so they feel that, well, why is it worth my time? I'm not going to bother if the system doesn't care about me. But I would argue that that's the exact opposite way of looking at it. The political system doesn't necessarily prioritize or care that much about what young people think on issues, because young people don't vote. So, like, as a thought experiment, let's just consider that if it were reversed. And so if people over the age of 60 decided, or 65 say, I'm retired now, I'm not going to worry about all this stuff, I'm just going to enjoy my retirement and not bother with politics or anything. And pretty soon, politicians and whatnot really wouldn't care that much what they have to think about an issue. And so even if they were, say, very vocal on social media about how, all these young people, all these millennials, they're all entitled and they're all, they're all a bunch of lefties or whatever, that's insane. We should do something about it. But if they don't vote, if the older people in that case don't vote, they can do all that all they want, but politicians ultimately won't actually care that much what they have to say about an issue. They will court the so-called entitled millennials, because if they're the ones that vote over 80%, then that's just logical. Politicians care about their careers, they care about getting reelected, they care about being popular, they care about ratings, and they care about not wasting their time. So in that case, what you might see is a vicious cycle where then a lot of older people go on to say, well, the politicians, they don't care what I have to say. They just think I'm some old timer. Why should I bother participating in the political system? And it would sustain itself for generations then of elderly voters. In that case, the exact same arguments would be levied. It'd say, well, older people, we're not taken seriously by the politicians, so we're not going to give them the time of day or whatever. Well, if you boycott something like that, it's not going to work out for you. These are pretty simple lessons. I mean, you can look at this on an international level too, where the Soviet Union boycotted the UN in 1950, and the UN was able to, get through the police intervention in South Korea after the North Koreans invaded. That wouldn't have happened with the support of the UN if the Soviets had been there. They boycotted it, and so the Security Council was able to basically almost unanimously say, yeah, we're going to do a police intervention. It was the only police intervention that the United Nations has authorized to date. And it happened because there wasn't any longer that compromise with evil. There was a very short period where that compromise was ceased because the Soviets stepped out, and they realized it was a huge mistake, and they never had that happen again. Russia always votes. The Soviet Union always voted after that. They were like, oh, that was a dumb move. That was a bad thing to do. That wasn't smart. And so the same thing happens here. So if you boycott the voting process, or if you don't show up or whatever, well, then it's going to go on. It's still going to exist, but it's not going to take your concerns into account. And so when that gets scaled up to the level of full age demographics in a country, the net effect is that if young people tend not to vote in high numbers, the political system isn't going to care about them that much. And it's not, I would argue, it's not an age discriminatory thing, because it could go for any age group. If people between the ages of 35 and 65 never voted, but the other two demographics, the people between 18 and 35 and the people over, say 65, they always voted, then you would see a weird political system where the politicians only care what really young voters have to say and what really old voters have to say. And everybody who's middle-aged might feel disgruntled and disenfranchised and say, well, I'm not going to show up or whatever. They don't care what I have to think because of my age. It's not an age thing. It's just a matter of interest group and rational-minded politicians that are self-interested going where they feel that there's the most likely ability to get reelected, and that's if they can court support from the people that vote in the highest concentrations, which in this case is people over the age of 60. Now, people over the age of 60, generally speaking, tend to be pretty socially conservative, and in the United States, kind of economically liberal. A lot of them generally support people such as Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman and the ideas of liberal capitalism, but they also support very staunchly generally speaking, very staunchly conservative social views when it relates to things such as religion, the idea of Abrahamic morality in particular, the idea of Judeo-Christian values, but I would argue Judeo-Christian Islamic values because it's all the same Abrahamic theology at the end of the day. And the only real difference between the two is largely a matter of skin color. Generally speaking, I mean, there are a lot of white Muslims too, but it's generally touted as a position of race that differentiates Christianity from Islam. And there's generally a very strong focus on maintaining the issues and priorities of elderly voters. So generally speaking, older voters tend to have more wealth tied up in the stock market, and they tend to have a lot more assets and a higher net worth than people under the age of 35, generally speaking. So they vote for people that will ultimately provide the most conducive way for stocks to grow the best and maintain largely what's considered, the economic status quo or whatever. I have a lot of agreements with that as a matter of principle, but it definitely in many cases comes from a point of self-interest. And the whole reason why the whole political system reflects that is just because they vote in such high numbers. And so if young people learn from that and cared enough to copy that, well, depending on the distribution of the population pyramid, in some cases, young people could overpower the older demographics. Now, that's harder to do these days because the life expectancy keeps growing, which is a good thing. And there are a lot more older people around today than there were, say, 50 or 100 years ago because of medical advancements and everything. But it's still theoretically possible for a larger mass of young voters to overcome the biases politicians have to represent older voters, particularly people that are retirement age. And so that's a matter of agency. And so if you're a young person and your relationship to the political process comes from and it is a function of an external locus of control where you believe that, well, the world is the way it is and the universe is the way it is and the politicians are the way they are and I can't change that and nothing that I can do will have any impact, so why should I care? I'd rather play Fortnite. Well, that's one way of looking at the world. Guess what? A lot of people that are over the age of 65, even if they might in some ways have that external locus of control, even if they might read horoscopes or something, they don't have an external locus of control with respect to the political process. They are engaged, they show up to vote, they go to the polls. They might not protest very often. You might not see them at some, big demonstration on the Capitol or something in high numbers. But I can guarantee you'll see a lot of them if you look at the lines to the polls on voting day. So, and more importantly, arguably more importantly these days, they write checks a lot more to politicians. A lot of them max out the maximum individual campaign contribution. So, whereas a lot of younger people don't. So, in that case, they have a clear internal locus of control where they feel that, well, they're going to make their voice heard. They're going to go through the system, through the legitimate means to make a difference. And they're going to express themselves. And they're going to make politicians care what they have to say on an issue. And they're good at it. And it's efficacious. Young people could have the exact same efficacy, but by and large, they choose to sit out. And so it's a matter of agency. It comes down to everybody has agency, but if you have an external locus of control, it doesn't matter at the end of the day because you're going to act as if you didn't have agency. You're going to act as if you're going to forfeit your rights that you were lucky enough to be born with, living in a free country, and live as if you were living in communist China where you can't vote. And so it's very sad. It's kind of tragic in a way that a lot of young people feel that way. but that's the reality. And so how this relates to Bernie Sanders and his electability is that he can raise a lot of money, and he's actually, in fairness to him, been doing quite a good job at that. I believe as of now, in the first quarter of 2019, he's raised somewhere around $18 million, which puts him like in the top 3 or so. He might even be in first technically right now. And a lot of that comes from small donors. I believe his average donation is somewhere around $20 or $30 or something. But that shows that a lot of people that are giving to him aren't maxing out, or on average aren't maxing out the allotted individual campaign contributions. So it is possible for somebody such as Joe Biden to have, say, 1/10 or 5% the number of donors. But if those donors max out the maximum individual campaign contribution limit, it is possible that he could raise an equal amount of money as Bernie Sanders. And so in that sense, they could tie. So Bernie's hyping everything right now as it relates to campaign contributions. Even if it's sustainable at these rates, the other big players in the political field right now on the Democratic side might be able to, 10x Bernie's average contribution rate over time as we get closer to the election, closer to the nomination process and everything. And so that is a current asset for Bernie, but it's not necessarily the end-all be-all. And it's possible that other candidates in the race right now might see huge boosts to their net revenue in terms of what they're able to attract donations-wise as we get closer to the debates, as we get closer to the nomination process. Now, so with Bernie, again, as I mentioned, he's got very high approval amongst people under the age of 35. The problem for him, he's got a clear asset there. It's arguably the best. He has the highest support. He's got the strongest asset in that age demographic of any of the candidates in the field currently. The problem is that a lot of those people don't vote. A huge percentage of them don't vote. And so if we're going to look at the facts of the matter, and we're going to look empirically at how these things tend to go, when the presidential election comes around, even if Bernie Sanders gets the nomination, which I'm very dubious about, I'm very cynical, I'm very skeptical that that's going to happen, but say for the sake of argument that does happen, and the Democrats do decide that they're going to nominate Bernie Sanders to run for the office of the President of the United States, the problem is that he's going to have an average voter turnout, if he continues to court young voters, somewhere around 40-45%, going off the historical average since 2002. That's what he could expect. That's not that good, because what it means is that Donald Trump could win with a smaller number of total people that might actually, he could win with a smaller approval rating, a lower approval rating. But if he has a higher voter turnout in the age demographic, say over 60, well, he could win, as Donnie Yester Vladimir Trump would say, he could win bigly. Like, it could be very, very bigly for him in the Electoral College. Now, I'll do another video on this at a later point, but I believe that if Bernie Sanders had been nominated in the 2015 to 2016 primary season for the Democratic nomination for the President of the United States, and he went up against Donald Trump, I believe that it would have looked similar to Ronald Reagan in terms of the Electoral College map. I don't support Trump. I'm against him. But if we're just looking at the numbers and we're looking at the demographics here, I think it's possible that Donald Trump would have basically rendered the Democrats and Bernie to basically having a fortress in Vermont, possibly Washington State, maybe California, but even that's somewhat skeptical. There are a lot of Republicans in California that don't necessarily get that much attention, but they vote big, and they vote in big numbers. It would have been just a bloodbath. Trump would have painted the map red. It would have been 450, 475, possibly even 500 electoral votes in the Electoral College for Donald Trump versus 30 to 75, or maybe if we're being generous here, 100 for Bernie Sanders. And why is that? Well, it's because and this is relevant now because we might be facing the same situation in 2020. What would have happened is that a lot of older Democrats that are historically always vote Democrat for the Democratic Party, a lot of them, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65 and on, in terms of age, would have looked at this and said, well, I don't like Trump. I don't like how he talks about Latinos. I think he's a racist. I think he's bad news. I think he's a reality TV show clown. But then they look at Bernie Sanders, and he's actually calling himself a socialist. And they say, well, I'd rather have a reality TV show clown and a racist, but I'll take that over somebody who might cause the whole system to go into calamity and cause the United States to look like Venezuela. Now, that is possibly what could have happened. I argue that was almost a guaranteed outcome. Now, maybe the only 100 electoral votes for Bernie is a bit hyperbolic. Maybe he gets closer to 150, but it still would have been so skewed for Trump. I mean, Trump would have turned pretty blue states red. And I don't like Trump, but he would have done the whole shit. He would have said, well, are you going to trust me, who's this shining example of what our country's capable of with capitalism and everything? Even though I argue he's not actually a great businessman. I argue he's got negative net worth. Probably owes the Russians a lot of money. He's gone bankrupt 6 times. But he's great at messaging. And he would have said, I'm a big businessman. I'm huge. I'm bigly. Are you going to go with me and I'm going to make everybody rich and I'm going to make America great again? Or are you going to go with a socialist? And a lot of those people that are 35, 40 and on actually lived through the original Cold War. Now, I argue, and I'll talk about this in other videos, of course, but that the Cold War as a general geopolitical interaction never really ended. The only difference was that the West pretended it was over in 91, and the Soviets switched out communism for fascism when they became the modern Russian Federation. It's still the same KGB, they just changed the name. There's still the same view of the West as the enemy, but it comes from a position of ultra-conservative, orthodox Christianity and political fascism now, as opposed to ultra-conservative, communist orthodoxy. That's the difference. But Russia still views us just as much as the enemy as they did in 1989 or 1991 or 1972. But a lot of these older people lived through the explicit official Cold War, which is usually dated at 1989 or 1991. And they know what socialism looks like. When they hear the term socialism, they think either very cold, snow on the ground, Ivan Denisovich, Gulag type situation. Or they think tropical dictatorship, Fidel Castro, left-wing death squads, no internet, no food, collective farms, and ultimately, in both cases, great leader blasting his praises over the speakerphones and over the loudspeakers in every village and every town, and everybody waking up in the morning and dusting the portraits of the great leaders. That's what they envision when they hear the word socialism. Now, I know that Bernie Sanders is not talking about that when he talks about socialism. He's talking about social democracy, and I'll get into this in a bit. He's talking about social democracy, and Kyle Kulinsky of Secular Talk and David Pakman of the David Pakman Show have both done a pretty good job of pointing this out. And Kyle Kulinsky in particular, I have a lot of disagreements with him, in particular on foreign policy, but he did a great job on going over why he thinks it's dumb for Bernie to refer to himself as a democratic socialist and why he should more accurately refer to himself as a social democrat, because that's ultimately what he is. But Bernie, it's a political reality. We're dealing with facts. We're dealing with the real world here at Superpower Broadcasting. So Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist. That is poor branding. Even if you think he's correct on the issues, it's poor branding. Whereas Donald Trump is objectively incorrect on a lot of the issues. But he's good at branding. That's what he does. If I were to give him credit for anything, he's a terrible business person. He owes a lot of money to the Russians. He is politically incompetent. He can't get bills through. He was offered a lot of money, over $20 billion for the border wall, and he turned it down, and now he's looking at pennies to the dollar, basically, as a compromise. He can't get his wall through. He can't. The only thing that he's managed to get through, basically, are the tax cuts. That's the only real substantive domestic policy that he's really managed to get through that requires congressional and Senate say over. But that largely wasn't due to his political tact or savviness. That was due to people such as Mitch McConnell and others in the Republican Party and the Republican caucus that had to compensate for Trump's stupidity. Trump's not a bright guy. He calls himself a stable genius, yet he's one of the dumbest people I've ever seen. He thinks that the term clean coal involves actually taking the coal out of the ground and cleaning it. It's so funny. Whenever I hear that, whenever I go back and watch that clip, I always think, whenever he says, it's clean coal, it's not dirty coal, it's clean coal, they clean it. I'm just picturing some, Charles Dickens-esque, a Christmas Carol type scene where you have some child in some poor safety standards factory somewhere, and, little Timmy's just there, and he's scrubbing that coal hard for his 10 cents an hour. And, the brutal supervisor comes over and says, scrub that coal harder, Timmy. I see some black spots on it. And Timmy keeps on scrubbing the coal with soap until there's none of it not. That's how stupid this guy is. And he's the United States president. Why is he the president? Well, a big factor in it was that he's very good at branding. He's very good at repeating the message. He doesn't read anything. He doesn't even read the daily intelligence briefings, which is dumb, because if I was the president and I didn't even care about the country, if I didn't care about anybody, I'd still want to know what's up, like, intelligent-wise. I'd probably be pretty curious if Roswell or something like that happened, if that was a real thing. I'd be interested. Now, I don't buy into a lot of those conspiracy theories, but hey, I'd be curious. I'd be interested to find out all that classified stuff. He's an incurious charlatan. He's somebody who literally just sits there and thinks about golf and cheeseburgers when he could have access to all this information that nobody else is privileged to have. Yet he chooses to go in a direction of just sheer ignorance, sheer incompetence, and yet he's very good at marketing, because what he says is, well, hey, look, you can place all your faith in me, and I'm going to make America big. I'm going to make America huge. I'm going to win, and we're going to win bigly. That's his whole thing, and he says that over and over and over again, and he gets his sycophants, and he gets his yes men to go on Fox News in particular, which a lot of that age demographic of over 60 watches, even though Fox News only has about 1% of the United States watching them daily. It's about 3 million people. It's almost all in that over 60 age demographic, almost all of whom vote, and all of the other networks don't even come close. So he has this perfect messaging campaign that is able to, trump up his pedigree as it relates to a lot of this. And he's able to make himself look like a genius, and a lot of people buy it, and a lot of people fall for it, and a lot of people say, oh yeah, well, he's a great businessman. He says he has $10 billion. He might make the country great again. And then they'll look at Bernie Sanders and they'll say, well, he's calling himself a socialist. I don't want to become like a denizen of Cuba or a denizen of Venezuela. That's generally the connotation that gets associated with socialism. And so it's a very poor and very unsavvy move on Bernie Sanders' part. And I know that Bernie Sanders would say, well, hold on. There are recent polls that have come out and say that somewhere over 50% of people under the age of 35 have a positive association with the word socialism. And that socialism has a higher net approval than the term capitalism amongst that age demographic. But again, I would go back to this and say, I know that Bernie isn't hiring a lot of very sort of savvy political consultants. He's trying to have a genuinely grassroots campaign. But this is one area where he would be better served to have some of those Beltway political consultants in his camp, because they could give him some sort of marketing advice at the least to negate Trump's advantage, and to say, hey, look, you might not want to use socialism. You can still advocate for all these policies or whatever, but you might want to be a bit cautious about that, because a lot of older voters are sensitive. And may show them some pictures of the Soviet Union in 1984, or North Korea in 2018, or Cuba today, for example, and say this is what people see when they think of socialism. I know you think of Norway, but they see Ivan Denisovich. They see, what Alexander Solzhenitsyn warned the world about, and which a lot of the people on the left had denied for decades and continue to do apologia for Stalin for. But today it's pretty clear that socialism, it's almost all received as a negative in the American political sphere. And so Bernie, in courting younger voters, it's not a smart move, because what's going to happen is, if he does manage the potential nomination, which I think is unlikely, but say, for example, he did, well, he'll say, I have so much higher support amongst young people than Donald Trump has. And that's true. But most young people don't vote. So even though they might say, oh yeah, I like Bernie, Bernie's cool, I like him if people ask. Well, but they know that they're not actually going to show up that day because they wanted to play video games or something. Now, some people that are young definitely will. They're genuine, they'll have the Bernie bumper stickers and they'll show up and vote for him. But a lot more older people will have the Donald Trump bumper stickers and they'll show up and vote for him. So Bernie, in courting and resting so much of his chances on a demographic that has a 55 to 60% absenteeism rate as it relates to the election, that's not smart. It's just really not smart. He could still champion all these policies, and he could still get all those young people that would vote for him normally to still vote for him, but market it in such a way that it would appeal to older voters, such as not calling himself a socialist and not saying, the system is broken and we're going to do radical reform or whatever, so much as we're going to make some improvements or something, or we're going to fix some of the flaws in the system, but we're not going to cause some, massive upheaval or something. If he marketed it in an Obama way of doing it, where Obama initially had some very radical rhetoric, and he had a lot of, he had the whole yes we can line, and he had a lot of that sort of stuff. But he never went in the socialist direction. He always sort of had, as it related to economics, he had a pretty incrementalist way of looking at the world and a way of branding himself. He had very radical statements that didn't have much political substance behind them, such as yes we can, whereas Bernie has radical statements, such as calling himself a socialist, that have real political substance behind them and will really hurt his campaign. And so that's a problem on Bernie's end. And it's something that if he doesn't sort out very shortly, even if he wins the nomination, he will be doomed to lose the election to Donald Trump. And that is very much a problem for the country and the world. And so, as I see this, Bernie Sanders and socialism in general, he's a very smart guy. He's a smart figure who's been in politics for a long time, decades. He's been in the Senate for a very long time. He's good at courting Republican voters in Vermont, but when it comes to Republican voters in Mississippi and Alabama and Ohio, California, it's not going to work out for him because the problem is that the actual definition of the word socialism is not on his side. When you look at the definition of the word socialism itself basically means, and this is the generally accepted definition in the technical sense, it means an economy in which the government owns the means of production, or a more sort of leftist way of framing it might be that the means of production are owned democratically. But what that means is that all industries, all businesses are under the management of the government. And so the Soviet Union was an example of that. They called themselves socialist, and they were aspiring to communism, but they had a socialist economy where the government manages and has a planned economic central planning system. Central planning in and of itself doesn't necessarily have to be part of socialism in terms of a 5-year plan sort of way of looking at it, but management from the government is definitely part and parcel of socialism. Socialism means that private property is also the domain of the government. So an example of this is communist China, for example, where even if you pay off your mortgage, even if you own your house or your condo, the Communist Party still gets full exclusive domain over it after 99 years, because ultimately everything is the property of the party. Everything is collectively owned, so to speak, if you're being from the leftist way of viewing it. Whereas in a capitalist system, you have private freehold house ownership, for example, where all you have to do is pay property taxes, but your family could own that house for 1,000 years, for example, if you passed it down. There's the idea of free enterprise and private industry and private corporations and capitalism that doesn't exist in socialism. So, for example, Facebook and YouTube are private companies, and they exist in a capitalist system in the United States and other countries. If we were in a socialist economy, Facebook would be a bureau of the federal government. YouTube would be another bureau of the federal government. These would all be government agencies. The railways would be nationalized. The airlines would be nationalized. The television manufacturers would be nationalized. The cell phone manufacturers would be nationalized industries. The food manufacturers would be nationalized industries. They don't necessarily have to be collective farms in the Soviet sense, but all of the farms, all the companies that would deal with the distribution of food, Monsanto would be a division of the federal government. All of these would be state-owned enterprises. They would all be collectively owned, so to speak. They would all be managed by the government. And so socialism, one of the areas where there is a lot of misconception around is that, well, socialism equals dictatorship. It doesn't necessarily have to equal dictatorship theoretically. I would argue that in practice it basically always does, because the only way that you're able to transfer all of the private corporations and all of the private property and all of basically private ownership over to the management of the government is through force. It would basically require death squads and require adherence to the great leader. It sets up a situation in which there's not a credible checks and balance system, where there's not enough freehold assets and there are not enough independently powerful people outside of the government that could challenge the government credibly. If everything gets allotted to the government, and the government ultimately has power over everything, even if it initially begins as a bureaucracy, it would eventually consolidate into an illiberal and maybe even a totalitarian dictatorship, because that's the only way that you could credibly guarantee the transfer of assets and the transfer of the institution of private property over to government management. That's what socialism is. There's a huge misconception out there that Sweden and Norway are socialists. They are not socialists. They are capitalist social democracies. You can start a business in Sweden or Norway, and you can own that business. You have to pay taxes, of course, and they'll have a higher tax rate, and they'll have a lot more government programs. But it's all a free market, a free enterprise system. There's still private property. You can own your own house in Sweden. You can own your own house in Norway. In a socialist system, all of that ownership would be in the domain of the government, and you would basically be seen as renting whatever property you happen to have from the government. You know, if you have a car, it's still an asset of the government. You're still just renting it, so to speak. The government can still confiscate things. Everything, such as we see in communist China, where the government is able to go in and demolish people's houses and put up, say, a city hall or something, or a nice skyscraper to make the party look better, to fulfill some 5-year plan in terms of concrete production or something. And of course, they'll inflate their GDP figures alongside with that. What they'll do is they will ultimately be able to do that, and you won't be able to challenge it. They'll send you to, say, go and live in some village in the farmland or something, and go and become a farmer, because the party ultimately has jurisdiction over all land, and so they can do that. Whereas in a capitalist country, even if eminent domain is present, the government still has to compensate you at a fair market rate for your property, even if they will demolish your house. And even if you don't want them to, they still have to pay you a fair or possibly even a premium for doing so, because the institution of private property is fundamental and is an attribute of a capitalist system. So there are very social democratic countries such as Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, but they're all capitalist. They're all basically just as capitalist as the United States. They just have different priorities for how the government, what sort of role the government has. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, there's a social contract there where the healthcare sector is deemed to be part of the government, but they still have a capitalist economy anyway, because they deem that particular industry to be of such market failure or such prone to market failures that it requires government intervention, doesn't mean that you can't own a soccer team, say for example, in the United Kingdom, because it's not a matter of life and death. That's your right. If you have the money to do it and you want to invest in it, you can go ahead. Now, you might lose money with it. You might make a lot of money with it. It could go either way, of course. But that's a capitalist system. In a socialist system, the soccer team would be owned by the government. In Libya, for example, soccer teams were owned by the government, and they had such a socialist system that the great leader Gaddafi required that he be the only celebrity in the country. So part and parcel with that socialist system, with the Libyan Jamahiriya, I think the name of it was, basically Arab socialism, similar to Baathism. The idea was that all the soccer players, the announcers were only able to refer to them by the numbers on their backs, even if they were very good, even if they were like pro level, the great players. They were only able to refer to them as, say, number 24. They couldn't refer to them by name because the great leader Gaddafi, he's the only one who's allowed to be mentioned by name. He's the only one who's allowed to be celebrated. A lot of these countries don't necessarily go to that same extent in a socialist system, but it's that emphasis of the government's domain over not just property, but people as well. The collective ownership, the collective will manifested through the great leader. That is basically a socialist system. Now, Bernie Sanders, he's not arguing for any of this, of course. He's arguing for social democracy. So it's a bad move for him to pitch himself as a socialist. And I think that it will do him, and I don't think that he has a reasonable chance of even clinching the nomination given this. It's just too much of a liability. In the year 2019, for anybody who's aspiring to get the nomination, the Democratic Party, which is a liberal party, to call themselves a socialist, which is an illiberal ideology, even in the theoretical sense, like even in the pure sense where it's not a dictatorship, where it's not authoritarian, in whatever Marxist theoretics, which even then Marx still advocated for the dictatorship of the proletariat. But let's say we go with some softer form of socialism, but still have a socialist system. You're going to have it where, in that case, that's still an illiberal system because it does not allow for free enterprise. It does not allow for private ownership. It does not allow for, say, for example, any industry, no matter how trivial, to produce outside of the management of the government. Now, a capitalist system can have regulations. I am a pro-regulatory I'm a market capitalist, but I believe that in order to prevent market failures, we have to have enough regulations that preclude market failures from devouring the system. I think libertarianism is dumb. I mean, I'll just say that right now. I think libertarianism is insanity. But when it relates to management, there's a difference between regulating a private industry and managing and overseeing and running that industry. And so this is why socialist countries, even the ones that aren't as brutal, even the ones that aren't as authoritarian, such as Yugoslavia, which did have some relationship with the West during the Cold War, the official Cold War, they still were poor at producing consumer goods. They were still poor at producing cars and toothpaste and lingerie and all these other things that are kind of part and parcel and get taken for granted in a capitalist system, because the government deemed every industry to be the collective ownership. And so socialist systems are arguably in a wartime, such as the Soviet Union, in some ways more productive at producing more material. The Soviet Union produced something like 35,000 main battle tanks during World War II and leading up to World War II under the 5-year plans. They produced a lot of nails. They produced a lot of heavy processed heavy metals and a lot of heavy manufacturing products like tractors and whatnot. What they were very poor at was producing things like, again, lingerie, gum, toothpaste, books, all kinds of stuff, just random things, plates, all the stuff that you don't necessarily think of as being associated with something that the government would need to manage. In a socialist system, the government manages all aspects of the economy. Whereas in a social democratic system, the government manages more aspects of the economy than in a neoliberal system. But the economy is still a regulated capitalist model. It's not a government-planned system. And so for Bernie Sanders then to be calling himself a socialist, what it's going to do is in 2020, as I mentioned, what I thought in 2016, if he ran and managed to get the nomination over Clinton, was that he would have got far fewer electoral votes than him. And now a lot of people like Kyle Kulinsky, for example, and Jimmy Dore in particular, and I believe I've seen David Pakman make a similar argument, but I'm not going to say for sure that he made this specific argument, but I've seen similarly sympathetic arguments from him that Bernie Sanders would have just wiped the board. He would have beaten Trump by so much because he would have appealed to the working class voters in the same way that Trump did. Well, I would argue, he might have appealed to some of those working class voters in, say, Wisconsin, for example, and maybe Trump doesn't win Wisconsin. But he would turn off older Democratic voters in California, middle class voters in California, maybe Democrats that make $85,000 a year and always vote Democrat. They might feel safer voting for Trump than voting for a socialist, somebody that calls himself a socialist at least. And so I feel that in that case, Trump, even though he might have lost the Rust Belt, I think that their argument isn't entirely flawed. Bernie Sanders probably would have done better in the Rust Belt than Donald Trump. But he would have turned states that used to be solid blue states into either swing states or just outright red. It would have been that. I mean, people forget that California, there are a lot of Republican voters there. Just because they don't, and the same with Texas, there are a lot of Democratic voters there. But he would have made the Democrats in Texas, by and large, outside of Austin, basically feel, I'm a Democrat, but I'm going to vote for Trump because he's a safer bet. Or, he might be a clown, but at least he's not a socialist. Or they might have made middle-class voters in California feel, I don't like Trump. I would have preferred voting for Hillary. I would vote for Hillary if she was running. But I'm not going to take my chances on a socialist. I'm comfortable where I am. I'm going to vote for Trump. And so Bernie would have canceled out or done better than Trump's advantage in the Rust Belt. But he would have turned states that used to be solid Democratic assets into Democratic liabilities. And he would have handed 450, 475 electoral votes to Donald Trump. That's just my view, but I'm pretty confident in it. I think about this stuff a lot. I am sympathetic to some of Bernie Sanders' arguments when it relates to social issues in particular. It's not like I hate the guy or anything. I'm critical of a lot of his economic, in full disclosure, I'm critical of him on foreign policy and economics, but generally speaking on social issues, I'm in his court. And I generally think he's a nice guy. I think he's well-meaning. I don't think of him as malicious in the way that Donald Trump is. So where I see Bernie Sanders' foreign policy helping Russia in the world, I don't think it's because he owes money to the Russians. I don't think that it's malicious or anything. I don't think that he comes at it from a place of malintent. But I think he in that sense would be more classified as somebody who's just an unwitting perpetuator of Kremlin interest abroad. But so those are my biases against Bernie Sanders, is that I'm a liberal capitalist and I'm somewhere between a liberal hawk and a neoconservative on foreign policy. But I'm a social liberal like him. I would take him over Trump. And I'll say this, even though I disagree with him on a lot of stuff, I would take him over Trump because at least he's, in that case, still an American. He's still somebody who is an American patriot. He's still doing the best that he sees for the United States of America. Whereas when I see Trump, he's doing the best for the Russian oligarchs that he owes money to. That's why he pulled out of Syria. That's why he changed the party platform to hand over Ukraine, and in particular Crimea and the eastern regions of Ukraine, to the Kremlin sphere of influence. That's why he's cozy with Kim Jong-un, another one of Putin's friends. That's why he'll talk tough on Iran but never actually do anything about Iran, because Iran is an ally of the Kremlin. That's why he'll talk tough on Venezuela but never actually do anything about it, because Maduro and Putin are allies. He's somebody who ultimately at the end of the day is a Russian asset, and he's largely a willing Russian asset, and he has a financial interest there. And I believe he's violated the emoluments clause of the Constitution for sure, even putting the Russian stuff aside. I would be shocked if he actually disassociated himself entirely from the Trump organization and his presidency. I would be truly shocked by that. So with Bernie Sanders, there won't be all these financial and other sort of foreign policy conflicts of interest. I just happen to disagree with him on foreign policy. But I think he's a genuine actor. I think that he's somebody who's not disingenuous. I think he's somebody who is a well-meaning and well-intentioned man who has done, actually, in fairness, a lot of good work over the decades to represent underrepresented groups. He's done a lot in terms of the civil rights movement. He has been a champion on a lot of social issues for good and for a progressive agenda. And so, in that sense, if he ever did get the nomination, I would be rooting for him against Donald Trump. And so that's why some of this comes at a place of criticism of Bernie Sanders, but a lot of it comes at a place of, well, if he does win, I really hope that he takes this advice to heart and stops branding himself as a socialist, because I genuinely think it'll hurt his campaign. I genuinely think that it would help Donald Trump so much, where even if that talk might appeal to some disgruntled working class people in the Rust Belt, it will turn off so many formerly reliable middle class voters in other states such as California, but also not to mention, of course, the other swing states. I mean, even if the Democrats hold on to all of the traditionally stable blue states like California and Washington and Oregon, he could still lose them, all of the swing states. That can't happen. Like, you can't lose Florida. You can't lose Ohio. You can't lose Iowa. You can't lose all these important swing states, because even if you win bigly in the states that you traditionally do well in, even if you manage not to turn off middle and upper middle class traditionally Democratic voters in blue states, if you lose the swing states, I mean, it's a low bar to say, well, hey, I held on to all of our blue states. Like, you can't become president. You can't become president and do that. You might be able to ward off a total bloodbath in terms of the Electoral College, like Ronald Reagan was able to get. It might not be that bad, but it might be. It could be like a 1984 election where Ronald Reagan takes all but the District of Columbia, and I believe it was Minnesota. That could happen, but I don't think it would be Minnesota. I think it would be Vermont that Bernie Sanders would probably hold on to. But Donald Trump could still take 49 other states. That's still a possibility. The fact that this is even a discussion that warrants serious analysis proves why Bernie Sanders isn't the best to nominate, especially if he continues with this rhetoric of socialism. Because even if he spends 2 hours in a town hall explaining what separates his brand of socialism, which is social democracy, and he should call it as such, from the authoritarian dictators in the world, that's a bad position to be in, just from a branding point of view. It's like that politician who ran and said, I'm not a witch. Well, it made a lot of people ask, well, wait, are you a witch? Like, where did that come from? Or when Donald Trump says, I'm not an idiot, I'm a genius, people are like, wait, where did that come from? It exposes vulnerabilities. And so if Bernie Sanders tries now to say, hey, look, I'm not a socialist, Donald Trump doesn't necessarily have to do that. He doesn't have to say I'm not a socialist, because even though I argue a lot of his policies are socialist, They come from that traditionally socialist way of looking at things, such as his economic protectionism, the tariffs, and then subsidizing the farmers to offset the damage done by the tariffs, the appealing to the steel workers at the expense of an 80 times larger segment of the economy that gets hurt in terms of higher prices, the opposition of free trade, all these illiberal positions that he has economically, I see as largely rooted in the socialist tradition. But he doesn't have that weakness because he didn't brand himself as a socialist. He branded himself as a capitalist. Whereas Bernie Sanders, he branded himself as a socialist. If he retracts it, it's still a good thing. I think that he could still do better. But whether he retracts or maintains it, if he spends 2 hours trying to explain all the differences between him and the regimes, all that Donald Trump needs to do is spend 10 seconds and say, hey, he calls himself a socialist. Check out this speech. I got news. Venezuela, Cuba, and China and North Korea are socialists. Do you want to be like them? And he'll win with the demographic that votes. He'll win with, like, that argument would win. That argument would be more convincing with people that are over the age of 60 because they'll tend to watch Fox News, and Fox News will show 100% of that short clip from Trump, and maybe they'll show 5 seconds of Sanders that's edited in such a way to make him look bad. It's just, he's just giving material. He's giving fuel to his enemies by calling himself a socialist, and it's a bad move. It comes from a place of ironically poor savviness, even though he has a very, very long and illustrious track record of being a savvy and constantly reelected politician. I don't think that he's presidential material. Now, I know that will trigger a lot of people. That will make a lot of people say, well, Kevin, you're a liberal capitalist. You're a no good neocon. What do you like? You're obviously, you don't know what you're talking about. Bernie would wipe the floor. And I'm just saying here, whether I'm 100% a big fan of Bernie Sanders or I'm 0% a fan of him, I'm somewhere in between. I'm probably around 30 to 40% a fan of him, if I'm being honest. There's a lot of stuff he says that I really like, and there's a lot of stuff that he says that I'm kind of cynical about. And there's some stuff he says that I just disagree with, But the thing is, the numbers from 2002 to 2016, those numbers, the 45% young people voting, that's a fact. Whether I'm a far right, charlatan like Jordan Peterson or something, or I'm a far left Bernie fan like Jimmy Dore, those numbers are still true. Like, I still have to somehow interact, and I still have to come to terms with those numbers. And so I'm trying to give advice to Bernie Sanders here and say, Bernie, if you ever happen to listen to this, you should realize that the young people in that demographic, those young people that are passionate about you and do show up to vote, they're going to vote for you almost no matter what you say. You've earned their vote with your 50-year track record of service to the country and the positions that you've consistently held to over the years. You don't need to spend all this energy trying to get young people to vote for you. What you need to do, and the obstacle over which you need to ultimately prevail and work towards overcoming, is you need to market yourself in such a way that older people and independents and middle-class people in blue states or swing states that aren't the type of Rust Belt Republican voter that you might try to court. Those people still matter, and they're a huge percentage of your base still in the Democratic Party. And I know that you're an independent, but you're running for the leadership, you're running for the nomination and the candidacy as the nomination of the Democratic Party to be president. So you have to care about middle class, largely white Democratic voters that make $85,000 a year or make $95,000 a year. They're not rich, but they're quite well off. They're quite prosperous. They're quite affluent. And they traditionally vote for the Democrats because they believe in things like that gay people should have the right to get married. And they're open to a Democrat. Their default is to vote for the Democrat. But if they hear you talking about socialism, most people haven't done a 5-year degree in political science like I have. Most people haven't studied the nuances of various different political systems. Most people, when they hear the term socialism in America, they think of the Soviet Union, they think of North Korea, they think of Cuba, they think of China. It's largely a lot of the younger people that will erroneously think of Norway and Sweden. But in both cases, they're wrong to think of you, Bernie, as being associated with a socialist system, because you're actually a social democrat. But they're not wrong to think that if they haven't done much research, because you tell them that you're a socialist. And so my advice would be, you have to maintain the Democratic base, which is a much more liberal, it's a much more moderate base historically than you're coming from. You have to, your challenge here isn't to court disgruntled workers in the Rust Belt. It's not to court 28-year-old people who just graduated from college and want free tuition or want student loan debt forgiveness. Your challenge is to court Democratic voters, blue-leaning voters who own 1 or 2 BMWs and already have a house that they're, say, 40% through the amortization track on their mortgage, you know. They're people that are genuinely affluent, and they're generally people that are invested enough in the system the way that it is, where if they want some reforms, they're likely to vote for you, but they're not going to vote for you if they think, oh, socialists, they're going to turn the whole system into Venezuela, and I'm going to lose everything I've worked for in my life. They're not, that's not going to appeal to them. And so that's your challenge if you're Bernie Sanders. And I am cynical. I don't think that Bernie's going to be able to do it. And fortunately, I don't think that he will be the nominee. But if he were the nominee, I would be very worried. And I would offer him as much advice, as I could. But the way that things have been going, it's very hard to overcome your opponent's branding of you. That's something that Trump is very good at. It's one of his only areas of competency, is branding his opponents and branding himself positively. And he can credibly characterize Bernie Sanders as a socialist who wants the U.S. to become like Venezuela. And Bernie Sanders does not have a good retort, because if he says he's not a socialist, then he's a Democrat, or he's a social democrat. That's a good answer, and he might be able to explain it somewhat quickly. But if he says, no, I'm a socialist, but I'm not that kind of socialist, and goes into a long-winded explanation, most voters don't have that attention span. So what's going to happen on election day is that a lot of the young people that might like his stuff on Facebook won't show up to vote to the polls. The people that were already going to vote for him no matter what he said are going to show up and vote for him, and they'll be energetic about voting for him. But you can have all the energy in the world, your metabolism can be burning 1,000 calories a second, you can be full of energy. You can have a surface temperature of 18,000 degrees, Fahrenheit, and you can go to the polls and vote for this guy. Guess what? Still one ballot. You're still one ballot. This is a democratic system. You have to get at least 50% of the vote if there are 2 candidates running. Howard Schultz is running. He's running from the liberal capitalist side. He's running largely to counter Bernie Sanders. He's going to split the vote. That makes this an even bigger challenge, because he's going to hand Trump possibly the election even if a moderate Democrat wins the nomination, right? So that's a problem. Historically speaking, in about 240 years or so of, 230 something years of U.S. election history, the best an independent has ever done was in the 1990s, I believe, with Ross Perot, got something like 19%. Yeah, I think it was 19%. And so he was able to hand, I believe it was Bill Clinton, the election from George H.W. Bush, the best in almost a quarter of a millennium that anybody's ever managed to do is 19%. Howard Schultz ain't gonna do 19%. Like I like the guy. He's a great CEO. He's a great businessman. He's a pretty progressive CEO too. I mean, some of the stuff that Starbucks has done, they're a really good company. They are very good to their workers, especially given how a lot of other companies are. They're right. They're great, and he can run on that. But he ain't gonna get 19%. He's not going to get 19%. Even if he did, it wouldn't make a difference. Basically, at that point, you basically have to be getting like 33%. Like, for an independent to have a real chance at winning with strong Democrat, strong Republican candidates running, you basically have to be scoring about 33%. That's never happened before. That 13-point difference between what Ross Perot did and what you need to have a real shot at winning the presidency as an independent, that 13 points is huge. I mean, the difference between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney was a couple points. I mean, the difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was a couple points, and it's interesting because that was actually in Hillary Clinton's favor in the popular vote. But he was able to win the Electoral College. Now, some of the Bernie bros and whatnot, they'll argue, well, Bernie will just play the Electoral College system and he'll win the Rust Belt and everything. But again, I would argue, well, you can play that, but that whole strategy requires you having a solidified base in those blue states that you don't have to worry about, and you can just focus on those Rust Belt areas, or maybe you go to light red states and try to court those away. Like, I don't know, maybe you go to like Iowa or something where they might, or Kansas or something, and you go there and maybe you're able to pull enough Republican voters away to your side with your rhetoric that, you know, you win the presidency. The problem is Bernie Sanders' rhetoric is going to turn off so many middle-class voters and so many affluent voters that are traditional Democrats that he might lose traditionally stable states. So all of his assets are canceled out by these strong liabilities. And when Trump has these strong assets, and when Trump's so good at marketing, and when Trump doesn't have to worry about his base, like those red states are going to vote for Trump no matter what he says. I mean, as he said, and I believe him now, if he shot somebody on Fifth Avenue, he would still get the people of Alabama to vote for him. He would still hold on to the red states. He can do anything. He's the great leader. He can do anything in their view. He's the God Emperor. They'll still show up and vote for him. The Democrats are a tougher crowd. Generally speaking, the left is a tougher crowd and generally spends a lot more time thinking about issues and whatnot. There are plenty of very, very intelligent right-wing intellectuals out there. But it's a fact that, generally speaking, the Republican base tends to be a lot more basal, a lot more, as Trump said, he loves the poorly educated because their base happens to have a lot more poorly educated people in it. The Democratic base tends to be more middle class, a lot more university educated, a lot more upper middle class and whatnot, generally speaking. There are, of course, a lot of working class people too, but the Republicans kind of have a natural advantage in the working class. Whether it's warranted or not, that's a debate. That's a topic for another video. But when it comes to Bernie Sanders, you have to take all of these issues and you have to take a lot of these defaults and you have to say, okay, well, how am I going to win? Because you can have all the gripes with the system the way it is and the way that people think about politics. But Bernie's not going to change people's mind about socialism in a couple of years. I don't think he should either because he's misusing the term. He's actually a social democrat. Socialism, as I said, is the government management of the economy and property and the means of production. Bernie wants a social democratic free enterprise system. He believes that the government should be involved in more areas, but he still believes in a capitalist system. One of the arguments that's levied against him is that, he's got like some houses and stuff. He's got assets. He's got a positive net worth. Well, I'm like, yeah, but he's a senator for decades. Of course he's going to be wealthy. The point is the policies and what he actually believe in. And he does believe in a capitalist system, but he markets himself in a way that would lead most people to think that he doesn't, and that's a liability. And so I'm going to basically wrap this up right now by just basically saying that Bernie should be very worried, and a lot of the hype around Bernie that focuses on his net approval over Trump, it is overhyped. A lot of it is hyperbolic. A lot of it is honestly disingenuous. And the reality of the issue is Bernie Sanders polls very well in a demographic that doesn't show up to vote in very high numbers. Donald Trump does less well and is sitting around a 30 to 40% approval. But he does very well in the age demographic that shows up in high numbers. So, in that case, Donald Trump actually has the advantage. And I'll finish by saying this, basically, that as it relates to a lot of those younger voters, The issue is that, and this talking point has been mentioned by people such as Kyle Kulinsky and Jimmy Dore before, and some of the hosts on the Young Turks network, the main channel of the Young Turks, I should say, that, well, if Bernie was the one who was running, that would change everything, and all those old trends would be rendered null and void, and you would see maybe 80% voter turnout or 70% voter turnout from the young people. Whereas traditionally, as I've stated, it tends to be about 40 to 45%. Well, the problem that I have with this is that that's not intellectually honest and intellectually reasonable argument. Because you're basically assuming, well, a miracle will happen on Bernie's side. The trouble is that I could make the same case on Trump's side. I could argue, well, what if Trump manages to convince all the people that are middle-aged or the older people that Bernie Sanders is such a communist and a socialist that he gets, say, 90% instead of 80% of the older people. And maybe instead of 40% of the middle-aged people and the independents, maybe he gets 70%. Like, he could just as well have that miracle too, and that doesn't get discussed. And so both of them are unlikely and statistically improbable events to happen because young people were very fired up by Barack Obama. And statistically speaking, the majority of them stayed home. So on average, the majority of them stayed home on the election in November. Because guess what? A lot of young people just aren't that engaged in politics enough to show up to the vote. A lot of them have an external locus of control as it relates to the political process. A lot of them see the chicken and egg thing the other way around and think that, well, politicians don't care about them, so they're not going to care about politicians, when they should care about politicians so that politicians will care about them and care about making their voice heard. And so I think that all these arguments that say that if Bernie runs, that he'll somehow manage to get so much more young people to vote for him, they miss the fact that he'll turn off so many more older people that voted for Hillary Clinton that are going to actually wind up voting for Donald Trump. Because, like, even if that miracle happens, I'm skeptical about it. I think that he's going to get like 45%. Like, he won't get 40% young people to vote for him. He'll be on the high end of the average. He'll get like 45% voter turnout from people under 29. It's just not going to cut it. Even if he didn't turn off all the other traditionally Democratic voters, it still wouldn't cut it because Trump has such a huge advantage with older voters. But the problem is that Bernie Sanders, in doing all this and in getting that advantage, he's turning off a lot of older voters and a lot of traditionally Democratic voters, where a lot of liberal Democrats and a lot of moderate Democrats that voted for Hillary Clinton and voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and voted for Barack Obama in 2012. Maybe they voted for Barack Obama in 2008, but it's possible that they voted for John McCain in 2008. They're actually going to vote for Trump because they feel that Trump is a safer bet and won't rock the boat too much. And they'll see Trump as having a record of stock growth, which I don't think is necessarily attributable to Trump that much. Some of that is a result still that's carried over from Barack Obama. Actually, the stock market has had more, I would argue, more tumultuousness with Trump than it would have if Hillary won. But if Hillary Clinton won, those Hillary Clinton voters, those Barack Obama voters, they're going to be turned off. The older middle class Democratic voters, they're going to be turned off by Bernie Sanders, and they might vote Republican for their first time. It's possible. And so I think that this idea that it's like a Deus ex machina argument or whatever, that somehow Bernie Sanders is magically just going to tilt the table so much and it's going to be a landslide. No, that comes from people like Kyle Kulinsky and the Young Turks to some extent, but David Pakman's a lot more reasonable. They live in an echo chamber. They live in a world where they like Bernie so much and their friends like Bernie so much, and they think that he's right on the issues, so they think that everybody else in the country will realize it if he runs. Whereas I see it as, even if he runs and gets the nomination and gets all the speaking time in the world, all it takes is a 5-second clip of Donald Trump saying, hey, look, he called himself a socialist, and he's done. He's done because, again, people don't want to rock the boat, especially if they've worked hard for their career and for all the assets that they've accumulated. They're not going to take that chance. And I can tell you the majority of voters aren't going to do hours-long research to find out that, no, Bernie's actually a social democrat, and this is what social democracy means. In fact, I'd be willing to bet the majority of voters don't actually know specifically what social democracy even is. So if Bernie Sanders said, I'm not a socialist, I'm a social democrat, people still might hear, oh, isn't that just a fancy way of saying socialist? That they might think that, right? That's also a possibility. So I believe, I'll wrap this up now, I'll say, if Bernie Sanders becomes the nominee, I think it's unlikely, but if he does, there's a very high chance that not only will Donald Trump become the president again in 2021, but that he will come closer to the performance of Ronald Reagan in the 1984 election in terms of the Electoral College than he will with the close election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Donald Trump says he had this huge victory. It was a historically unprecedented victory over Hillary Clinton. No, it was like a 20 electoral point difference or something. I think it was like 290. I don't even think he cracked 300 electoral votes. No, but if he's against Bernie, well then, Trump has all the same populist arguments to appeal to the disgruntled voters that Bernie's trying to court. So he'll obviously get some of them. Plus, he has a stable Republican base that he doesn't have to worry about because no matter what he says, they'll do anything and they'll still vote for him. He can do anything and they'll still vote for him. Plus, he might win over a lot of independents and he might win over some affluent Democratic voters that just don't want to rock the boat. And they'll take their chances with a reality TV clown than risk voting for somebody they think is a socialist. Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, has almost every liability working against him because even where he has strong assets, such as the very high support with the young voters, they are matched by liabilities, such as the fact that those young voters don't tend to vote. And empirically speaking, and facts-based and evidence analysis-wise, I don't see any way that Bernie Sanders can be the president of the United States. And this is irrespective of whether I agree with him or not. I just see this as a fact. And so I think that the Democrats should be very cautious and nominate somebody that can actually defeat Donald Trump in 2020 and take the country back from being run by a Kremlin asset to being run by an American, to having the West be secure, having NATO be united, having American priorities and American interests in the world be represented over Russian and Kremlin, fascist Russian interests. And so, thank you for watching this. I know a lot of people will probably be very turned off by my analysis and have a very sort of negative reaction to it. But I would argue, whether you're on the left or the right, regardless of your relationship to Bernie Sanders politically, consider what I've said and just be careful about how this is going to go. Because I believe that if you elect Bernie Sanders, you're basically electing Donald Trump. And so thank you for watching, and thank you for your consideration in all of this. Thank you, YouTube.